Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us with the British in India. A special welcome to those from different time zones, and particularly to Robert Ivermee, who is joining us from Paris to talk about those who built settlements along the Hooghly River in Bengal, the Portuguese at Hooghly, the Mughals at Murshidabad, the French at Chandernagore, the Danish at Serampore, and the British at Calcutta, and how the Hooghly provided a conduit for trade, imperialism, new ideas, and technological change. Robert is lecturer in British Civilization at the Catholic University of Paris. He visited India after his first year of history at Oxford and was sufficiently fascinated to specialize in Indian history on his return. His master's degree was undertaken at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and his doctorate at Kent's Centre for Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies. This was followed by several years at SOAS, then the Catholic University of Paris. Hooghly is his second book, and we look forward, Robert, to your guided tour through Bengal's history as we accompany you up and down the river. The format of tonight's talk is that Robert will talk for 55 minutes, followed by question and answer. Please type any questions you have at any point into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Robert at the end of the lecture. Welcome, Robert. The rostrum is yours.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Thank you for the invitation to speak this evening and for the introduction. And thank you to the rest of you for coming. Thank you to Sarah as well for her help setting up. So let me start by introducing the geography of the Hooghly. As most of you will be aware, the River Hooghly is a distributary of the Ganges. So it's one of the branches of the Ganges that breaks away from the main body of the river and travels down through Bengal to enter the sea. The Hooghly is about 500 kilometers in length. It basically breaks away from the Ganges just a kilometer or so before what's now the border between West Bengal and so the Indian state of West Bengal and Bangladesh. East of the Hooghly is the start of the Bengal Delta. So there are lots of smaller waterways branching off from the left bank of the Hooghly across the Bengal Delta, which is of course the largest riverine delta in the world. Those waterways have, for a very long period, been essential for the movement of people. They connect Western Bengal, or traditionally before the national border at least was put in place between India and Bangladesh, they connect West Bengal with the rest of the delta right across to Dhaka and Chittagong in the east, and the border with what's now Myanmar. Okay, the Hooghly is not only one of the most significant of the Ganges distributaries, it's also of sacred significance. So in the Hindu tradition, the Hooghly is the original route of the Ganges, down from the Himalayas across the Gangetic plain and then into the sea. The Hooghly is the original and revered route of the Ganges. And until the 17th century, it's the branch of the Ganges that carried the most water from the top of the Bengal Delta down towards the Bay of Bengal. The river's other name, the Bhagirathi, evokes this sacred significance. Bhagirathi is a descendant of the King Sagara, who in the Hindu story convinced Lord Shiva to unleash the waters of the Ganges from the heavens down to earth. Okay, let me show you the structure, if you like, of the book about the Hooghly that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. The book is structured around 7 sites on the river, and you can see them listed here. So from north to south, we have Murshidabad, the capital of the Kingdom of the Nawabs of Bengal from the beginning of the 18th century. From the beginning of the 18th century until the power of the Nawabs is usurped by the English some 60 years later. We then have Plassey, which is of course the site of the battle that leads to the ascent of the English in Bengal after 1757. Hooghly, as we will see, is the original European settlement on the river. It's the original Portuguese town. The Portuguese, as we will see in a minute, are the first Europeans to arrive on the Hooghly and to found a settlement there. You can see the 4 dots on this map very close together: Hooghly, Chandernagore, Serampore, and Calcutta. Within a stretch of about 80 kilometers, we have the main European settlements along the river. Hooghly, as I've said, for the Portuguese, Chandernagore for the French, Serampore, which was the Danish town on the river, and then of course Calcutta, which becomes the capital in the 19th century of British India. The final chapter of the book is about the island, Saga Island, at the mouth of the river, where the river enters the sea. And if we have time, we'll come to Saga Island at the end of the talk tonight. The book is primarily about the European presence on the Hooghly from the 16th century until the end of the 19th century. But before we focus on that, let's just note that the Hooghly Basin has been inhabited for at least 3,000 years. It is probably the first and the most densely populated area of Bengal through that very early history. It was when I was doing my research for my PhD and spending a couple of months in Bengal in 2011 that I was based in Calcutta using the West Bengal State Archives. But when I wanted to get out of the city at the weekend, for example, I would travel up and down the River Hooghly using the train lines that run up and down the 2 banks of the river, and crossing the river at various points on the small ferries that connect the 2 banks, visiting the sites that we can see here. And it's from those visits that the idea for the book emerged, which was essentially to write about, in one single work, about the different European presences along the river. Over time, I came to understand that the approach that I wanted to adopt for the book was a global history one. What I mean by that is, well, first of all, to study a period during which the Hooghly is, I think I'd say in the book, at the center of global history, and where events that take place on the river truly have a global significance. Global history also refers to a conscious approach by which I try to understand how the river became integrated into global networks of trade, of migration, but also networks for the movement of ideas, for the movement of aspects of culture between the river and other places across the Indian Ocean and in Europe. Okay, so the book doesn't try to provide some sort of comprehensive history of the river or even of the 7 sites that we can see here. What it does is take each site as an opportunity to explore themes related to the river's global history. Okay, let's move on. In terms of the global history approach, this is a map that I like sharing with students when I'm teaching a class on the British Empire and globalization. I like it because we can see it's quite unusual in the sense that India is at the center of this map of trading routes in the British Empire, with Britain and the rest of Europe, unusually really not right in the middle. We can really see here, by studying the main trade and shipping routes across the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, the connections that exist between India and specifically the city of Calcutta on the river Hooghly and the rest of the world by the early 20th century. So one of the things that the book is concerned with, we can say, is how we arrived at this moment where the Hooghly is integrated and at the center of global networks, not just for trade, but for the movement of people and ideas as well. The first chapter of the book starts with the arrival of the first Europeans on the river, the Portuguese. The original Portuguese church built on the banks of the Hooghly was destroyed in an earthquake at the end of the 19th century. So we have to make do with this, this rebuilt church. From the middle of the 16th century, the Portuguese have been making an annual voyage from Goa around the Indian Peninsula and up the east coast of India to Bengal, because they begin to realize at this time the trading possibilities that Bengal offers. And in 1580, they request permission to found their own settlement on the river Hooghly. Bengal is at this time a province of the Mughal Empire. And a Portuguese merchant by the name of Pedro Tavares travels across land from the banks of the river all the way to the Mughal capital of Fatehpur Sikri near Agra to ask permission for the Portuguese to establish their own trading post on the river. We have no image of Pedro Tavares's visit to Fatehpur Sikri, but we do have this painting from a few years later of Emperor Akbar receiving two Portuguese Jesuit priests. The chapter on the Portuguese seeks to understand what life was like arriving in Bengal at this time, so from 1580 onwards. And it takes as its guide a Portuguese missionary by the name of Sebastian Manrique, who helpfully left for us an account of his travels in Bengal, published after his return to Europe in 1649. Manrique's account is particularly revealing about what life was like in the Portuguese settlement of Hooghly. So the Portuguese town goes by the same name as the river, the settlement of Hooghly. And there are some debates about where the name itself comes from. It might be a corruption of a Portuguese word. Alongside the trading community in Hooghly, the missionaries are the other big Portuguese constituency. And Manrique leaves us very interesting early accounts of his encounter and the encounter of European priests with the different religions that they find on the banks of the Hooghly. The chapter then attempts to understand why in 1632 the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan decides to attack Hooghly and expel the Portuguese. There are various different suggestions for why he feels at this time in 1632 that the Portuguese need to be removed from their settlement. Have they not paid sufficient taxes? Because for the emperor, the possibility of making money from the Europeans is one of the main attractions he sees in them, or is it? And this is the most likely explanation, I think. Is it that Shah Jahan is very concerned about the Portuguese capture and trafficking of slaves in the Bay of Bengal at this time? We have surviving accounts of the Portuguese slave market in Hooghly at this time, the capture of slaves from islands at the in the Bengal Delta, where the delta meets the sea, going right across to Chittagong. The main Persian chronicle of Shah Jahan's rule, the Pachahnama, suggests that this trade in slaves, which the Portuguese have been warned to stop, is the main reason why they are expelled by the Mughal army from Hooghly in 1632. Let's move on. The second chapter of the book is concerned with the development of the independent kingdom of the Nawabs of Bengal, whose capital, Murshidabad, is, as we saw a minute ago, on the banks of the Hooghly, slightly further north. The Nawab of Bengal, responsible for engineering the separation of the province from the Mughal Empire, is the man that we can see pictured here, Murshid Quli Khan. He is appointed as the Mughal governor of Bengal, but it's during his time as governor that the effective separation of Bengal from the Mughal Empire is engineered. The the sovereignty of the Mughal emperor in Delhi remains nominally respected by Murshid Quli Khan, but to all intents and purposes, in terms of revenue collection, in terms of the organization of his army, and in terms of making the position of Nawab a hereditary position that he passes on to other members of it is passed on to other members of his family after him, Bengal becomes a semi-independent or largely independent kingdom at this time. Alongside exploring how Murshid Quli Khan is able to engineer this sovereignty, this separation from the Mughal Empire, and create his own kind of dynastic succession, the chapter that tries to challenge accounts that read this period of Indian history at the start of the 18th century as a conflict between Hindus and Muslims. It considers some of the high-profile Hindus that are employed in Murshid Quli Khan's state. He is, of course, a Muslim ruler. And it suggests that economic gain and power are more important drivers than religion in understanding the politics of Bengal and of northern India at this moment. The chapter also tries to paint a picture of a kingdom where religious identities were more fluid and more complicated than the simple division of Hindu and Muslim suggests. So it explores various examples of what we would now call syncretic religious identity and practice. And this is one example that I particularly like. The Saint Khwaja Khizr is venerated on the Hooghly at this time by followers of different religions. This is a really good example of that kind of way in which the categories that we use to think about the history of India at this time are not necessarily the right ones. Bengali and Indo-Persian cultural and religious forms overlap in the kingdom of the Nawabs, and so do Hindu and Muslim cultural and religious forms. The chapter considers what is now quite a contentious or politicized question about why so many Bengalis become Muslim in this period. And it rejects ideas that are quite popular among, well, let's say Hindu nationalist historians in India now, suggesting that this is a state-led process of conversion of Bengalis to Islam. It draws on the work of Richard Eaton and other scholars, suggesting that what we have here is a slow process of acculturation by which older polytheistic forms of a religion are gradually replaced by adherence to Islam. The chapter makes the point that conversion is not really a suitable term for understanding that slow, gradual process by which, in the Bengal Delta, east of the Hooghly, a largely Muslim population develops by let's say, the 18th century. Okay, the chapter then moves on to consider the arrival of the Dutch, the book then moves on to consider the arrival of the Dutch and English East India companies on the River Hooghly after 1650. So remember, the Portuguese had been expelled in 1632, and soon after, the Dutch and English companies spot an opportunity, and they move in the first instance, to the former Portuguese settlement of Hooghly and begin to rebuild it. A few years later, the Dutch establish themselves slightly further down the river in the settlement that becomes Chinsura. And this is probably the best painting that we have of all of any of the European settlements on the river in the 17th century. We can see, of course, the river in the top left here, the fortified Dutch settlement in the foreground, and then the way in which the settlement is beginning to spill over from those fortifications to take up land slightly further downriver in this image. Okay. A few years after the Dutch, the English established themselves in Hooghly before settling on Calcutta as the basis for their Bengal operations. Chapter 3 of the book, which is the chapter centered around Plassey, tries to understand the transformation of the English East India Company from a commercial entity into a heavily militarized and territorial power. So we're thinking here about the period of the decades leading up to the Battle of Plassey, and then what happens in the 10 or 15 years after that moment. The argument made is that transformation might not be the right word, because from the beginning, the English company has had a militarized presence, has begun to fortify its settlements along the River Hooghly, has begun to show an interest in acquiring villages or small territories, has got involved in one war against the Mughals as early as the 1680s. In that sense, the development of the English East India Company into a colonial power in Bengal is something that doesn't begin out of the blue in 1757. Okay, by this time, by the 1730s and 40s, there has been a change of dynasty in Bengal, and the kingdom of Nawabs has been taken over by the dynasty of Alavadi Khan, who we can see here seated in the middle of the image. His grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who will be important in what follows, is also seated here on the right with the gold turban. If you can see my mouse cursor, you might be able to spot him here. During Alavadi's reign in Bengal, peace is maintained between the English and the French in the province, despite the war that by this point is taking place between England and France in southern India. We will talk about the French in a moment. And the rules of the kingdom are respected by and large by the English East India Company. But this begins to change, or this changes, let's say, in 1756, when Alavadi is replaced by his grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. And when just a few months later, war between England and France breaks out in Europe, this is, of course, the beginnings of the 7 Years' War. As many of you will undoubtedly be aware, the war leads to the capture of the French settlements on the river Hooghly, Chandernagore, and following that, the removal of Siraj-ud-Dowlah as Nawab of Bengal and the installation of Mir Jafar in his place. This is the events of the Battle of Plassey, but we won't spend too much time talking about tonight because of all of the different contexts and stories in the book. It's probably one of the ones that you are already most familiar with. Plassey is, of course, not the end of the conflict in Bengal at this moment. The conflict continues, well, at least until 1765, when the East India Company assumes powers of revenue collection over all of the province of Bengal, plus Bihar and Orissa, effectively taking over, well, as de facto ruler in those three provinces of the Mughal Empire. Chapter 3 then on Plassey in the book, consider what happens in the few years after this moment, after the English begin collecting revenue in Bengal. It looks at English attempts to impose their own trading monopolies on the river Hooghly and to collect revenue. And it considers the Bengal famine of 1770 and 1771, when an estimated 1/3 of the population, the local population, die. It asks the question of how far British war and revenue collecting practices are responsible for that famine. We will talk about these events again in a moment through the perspective of the French on the river Hooghly, who we should turn to now. So I like this map, partly because it's fairly little known, and partly because, well, it's a really fun attempt to map and understand the course of River Hooghly by a French cartographer in the 1720s. Again, if we look carefully, we can see the different European settlements on the river indicated just here. So most of the European settlements on the river are on the right bank. So the river is flowing, well, broadly speaking, from north to south, which in this image is from right to left. So the upper part of this map above the river is the river's right bank, where most of the European settlements, with the exception of Calcutta, are to be found. We can see here the river continuing south of Calcutta to enter the Bay of Bengal. So the French have arrived in Bengal later than the other Europeans, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English, partly because the French East India Company, the Company des Indes, is only founded in 1664. So that's roughly 70 years after its Dutch and English counterparts. And the French find it difficult to establish themselves in the Bengal trade. They find that their trading company, which has a very close connection to the French monarchy and state at this time, they find that it's very difficult for their trading company to make any money in the face of English and Dutch competition. After considering the first few decades of the French at Chandernagore, so that's from the 1690s onwards, the chapter turns to how the French react to their defeat in the 7 Years' War and the English capture of Chandernagore that we have just seen a moment ago from an English perspective. What's interesting is that for many people in France, when they learn that Chandernagore has been captured by the English, along with the other French colonies, Pondicherry, for example, in Southeast India, the overwhelming reaction in France is one of indifference. The French presence in India hasn't really registered among many people in Paris, among kind of educated, literate circles. And where it has, it's often been a subject of criticism. In France at this time, so the middle of the 18th century, there is a strong and growing sentiment that colonial trade and colonial expansion are not in the interests of the country. For some, the export of bullion from France to finance trade in India is draining wealth from the country. And French economists are very worried that colonial trade is costing more than it brings in. There's also a school of economists known as the physiocrats at this time in France, who are adamant that the wealth of a country comes from its land, comes from agriculture, essentially, and that trade, particularly in in items that are considered luxuries, like silks and spices, is a distraction from and also something perhaps weakening the moral fiber of French people at this time, that too much luxury is one of the reasons for France's defeat in the 7 Years' War. Alongside that bundle of ideas saying that colonial trade and a presence in India is not a good thing for France, there are also a number of writers and philosophers at this time, two of whom you'll no doubt be familiar with, Voltaire and Diderot, who are essentially arguing that the French presence in India is also morally unjustifiable. They argue, Voltaire first and then Diderot slightly later, writing in the 1760s as news of the loss of Chandernagore and the other French colonies is coming back to France. They examine what France and England have been doing in India over the preceding 20 or 30 years, in Bengal and also in the south, where they've been fighting a series of wars against each other. And they essentially argue that the presence of England and France in India is morally unjustifiable because based on the use of military force, contrary to the original intention of the English and French trading companies, which is, of course, peaceful trade, at least in their view, peaceful trade. So we see quite a strong current of anti-colonial critique developing in France at this time. In 1765, so 2 years after the 7 Years' War comes to an end, the French East India Company is permitted to retake control of Chandernagore and its 4 other settlements in India, but only on the condition that it restricts itself to trade. So from this moment on, the French essentially have to promise not to get involved in any Indian politics or to get involved in any warfare. And they are expressly forbidden from fortifying Chandernagore, fearing that if they do, it will be the pretext for a new war against the English. Here is an image of Chandernagore from slightly later, from 1800, but it allows us to think about the rebuilding of the French settlement after the reinstallation of the Compagnie des Indes in 1765. Those French people who have remained in India after the loss of Chandernagore and who returned to the colony in 1765, usually after taking refuge either with the Dutch or the Danish on the River Hooghly until the war with England is over. they feel let down, essentially. They feel let down by their East India Company, which has failed to raise sufficient funds or a sufficient army to take on the English in Bengal, to challenge the English. And they feel let down by the French monarchy as well, for similar reasons. They see an English trading company that is supported by its national government, and a French company that essentially has no money and no forces at its disposal. The governor of Chandernagore after 1765 is a guy called Jean-Baptiste Chevalier, and we don't unfortunately have a portrait of him, which is a shame because he's an important character in what comes next. Chevalier basically doesn't accept the French defeat of 1763, the Treaty of Paris at the end of the 7 Years' War, and he takes very badly the fact that the English are now the undoubted dominant power on the River Hooghly, and he begins to plot revenge through a new war against Great Britain. To do so, knowing that he has no soldiers at his disposal and that he is prohibited from fortifying Chandernagore, he begins to contact the different courts of North and Northeast India to try to form alliances with some of the other powers who have seen themselves marginalized or stripped of power by the ascension of the English East India Company over the preceding decade. Let's have a look. The three figures that you can see here have all essentially been defeated by the English by 1765. Mir Qasim is installed after Mir Jafar as Nawab of Bengal, but then deposed a few years later and joins the coalition fighting against the English East India Company in Bengal with the other two figures that you can see here. Shah Alam, the Mughal prince, and Shuja-ud-Dawla, the ruler of the state of Awadh in Lucknow. Okay, so Chevalier begins contacting these three figures who are nominally all at peace with the English after 1765, and tries to rally support for a new coalition to challenge the English ascendancy on the River Hooghly and, well, more widely in northern India. The other powers that he reaches out to at this time, sending coded letters or sending his own agents disguised as merchants, are the two important Maratha rulers, Mahadaji Scindia and Janoji Bhonsle, who you can see here. Chevalier realizes that the Marathas are perhaps the Indian power most likely to be able to challenge the English in Bengal and elsewhere in northern India after 1765. The one resource that Chevalier can draw upon in these efforts to form a new coalition against the English are the various Frenchmen who have entered the service of different Indian rulers after, well, let's say over the preceding over the preceding few years. So after the fall of Chandernagore in 1757, various Frenchmen have traveled across northern India and essentially taken employment with in different Indian courts. Let me show you two examples. Jean-Baptiste Joseph Gentil is increasingly influential at this time in the court of Shuja-ud-Dawla at Lucknow. René Madet travels from one court to another in northern India before eventually attaching himself to Shah Alam when the Mughal prince has returned, or the Mughal emperor by this stage has returned to Delhi in 1770. what's really interesting in Chevalier's efforts to form this coalition against the English and to challenge their ascendancy in Bengal is that in selling the project to his two directors of the French East India Company in Paris, and in selling the project to ministers at Versailles in France, and in selling the project to the different Indian courts at this time, Chevalier is arguing that the interests of France and the interests of the different Indian powers are aligned because they all have a common enemy in the English. And he's beginning to talk about a war that will not just deliver revenge for France and the other defeated powers, but also liberate India from oppressive English rule. The rhetoric of liberation is really growing at this time. It's the first use, or certainly one of the first uses in French policy in India, or in any colonial context for that matter, involving the French, of mobilizing ideas like fighting despotism, ideas like the rights of man, ideas of delivering freedom, using those ideas to argue for a new war against the English. When writers like Voltaire and Diderot have started talking about the rights of man in their works, they've mostly been doing so in order to criticize the practices of the French and English trading companies on the river Hooghly and elsewhere. But Chevalier and some other writers by the 1770s are using those same ideas, not to criticize the presence of the French and the English in India, but to essentially say, we can deliver freedom for India by acting in the interests of Indian rulers, and those interests are also our own. The same ideas that have previously been used in anti-colonial critique are beginning to be used to justify a war of liberation. Okay, let's move on. This idea of a new war against the English that will at once avenge the French defeat of 1763 and liberate India. This comes to a head with the Declaration of American Independence and the new war, the War of American Independence, in which Britain and France are, of course, on opposite sides from 1778. The same rhetoric of liberating a country from oppressive English rule that we have seen deployed on the Hooghly by Chevalier in the 1770s is used to justify French intervention in the American War of Independence. And of course, that intervention in North America is successful. The United States secures its independence in no small way because of French intervention in the conflict. That war is also fought in India, not in Bengal, but in southern India. We have an example here, the Battle of Cuddalore, pitting the French and British navies against each other. By 1783, the two powers are at peace. The United States has secured its independence, but no serious blow has been struck to the English dominance in Bengal, or indeed in southern India. And so the challenge, the opportunity, I guess, to challenge English ascendancy in India has been lost. Talking about the War of American Independence here, we can begin to see, hopefully, one of the ways in which there's a close connection between events in India, events on the River Hooghly at this time, and events well, on the other side of the world, in North America, in Europe, in the Caribbean as well. The 7 Years' War and then the War of American Independence are, well, conflicts that are fought globally and connect these different places in ways that, well, would have been far more difficult to imagine some 2 or 3 decades earlier. The helping of America to secure its independence from Britain has come at a very high cost for France. And we're now in the years counting down to the French Revolution of 1789. So the French monarchy and state is bankrupt after 1783. The events are in motion that lead to the outbreak of the French Revolution. The final part of the chapter of Hooghly, looking at the French in Bengal, examines how events over the previous 30 or 40 years in Bengal, well, first of all, how they helped shape the revolution in France. The presence of the French East India Company, the abuses carried out by the English in Bengal in the 1760s, 1770s, these are discussed in debates in the National Assembly that's established at the beginning of the revolution in France. In no small way, an awareness of what has happened in Bengal shapes the course of the revolution in France. And this is really the final point in the chapter, Chandernagore has a revolution of its own in 1789 or 1790. As I mentioned earlier, the residents of Chandernagore feel let down by their monarchy. They feel let down by their East India Company, and they feel abandoned, essentially. And when they hear that the revolution in France has started, they follow a similar course by deposing the royally appointed governor of Chandernagore and imprisoning him, by establishing some sort of constituent assembly that they say will make decisions from that moment forward. And by then writing a constitution for the colony. They also try, interestingly, to separate from the other major French colony in India, Pondicherry at this time, establishing a direct connection between Chandernagore and the new revolutionary government in Paris. As was mentioned before the start of the talk, when we were chatting, for those of you who were here a little early, this is a topic, the events of the French Revolution, that I'm returning to work on currently in a new piece of work about the French in India, which I'd be delighted to talk more about, maybe in questions. Okay. The final European colony, just to mention briefly, on the River Hooghly, is the Danish settlement of Serampore. Serampore is important not for our purposes, at least, because of the presence of the Danish East India Company, but because it welcomes in the 1790s, or actually in January 1800s, a small group of English Baptist missionaries. They are just about the first English missionaries in Bengal, because at this time the English East India Company prohibits missionaries from operating in territories that are under its control. This doesn't deter the Baptist mission from arriving in Bengal, and they find, I guess, political asylum in the Danish colony of Serampore. In 1800, they use Serampore as a basis for their mission activities. In In terms of making conversions, they are not very successful. William Carey is the leader of the Baptist mission. What we see here is his first Bengali convert, Krishnapal, baptized in a very symbolically important moment in the Hooghly in the year 1801. But if the Baptist mission is remembered today, and its story has been told quite a few times, it's not because of the number of conversions that the Baptists made. It's because of their role in instituting the first, or one of the first, printing presses in Bengal, and in translating texts into some 40 different languages at Serampore in the decade or so from the year 1800 onwards. This is a huge contribution to the development of a print culture in yes, some 40 Indian languages at this time. The Baptist mission is also involved in establishing schools and newspapers at Serampore and in many of the surrounding villages. The chapter that I write about the mission at Serampore tries to stress two things. First of all, it tries to stress how almost inadvertently the mission has an impact on the ideologies informing the presence of the English in Bengal at this time. The Baptist mission is apart, it's in Serampore. They are Baptists, they're not Anglicans, they are lower middle class, let's say. They are physically and socially removed from the English at Calcutta, but their ideas around education, around printing, around newspapers, around the formation of public opinion, I suggest have a large influence on how the English East India Company comes to justify its role governing Bengal by, let's say, by the year 1820. The other thing that I discuss in the chapter is the way in which different Indian parties reacted to the presence of this first major missionary group in Bengal. Some conversions are made, as we have seen, like the conversion here of Krishnapal. Some other Bengalis or people from surrounding areas of North India, they come to Serampore, they collaborate in the translation of texts. The example here is of the Pandit Mutunjay Vidyalanka, who was influential in the writing of a Bengali English dictionary at this time, and in the translation of certain texts into Bengali, the beginnings of a Bengali print culture. But interestingly, he is also an example of a figure who kind of pushes back against many of the missionaries' ideas. He refuses to convert to Christianity. He writes against many of the missionaries' criticisms of Hindu religion at the time. And he's an inspiration for perhaps the most well-known Bengali figure to resist aspects of the way in which the missionaries are trying to transform Bengal at this time. The figure that I'm talking about is Raja Rammohun Roy, who we can see here. The statue here is in Bristol, in England, where Raja Rammohun Roy travels and passes away. Rammohun Roy is really interesting because, on the one hand, and this is maybe where I will finish for now, he's very interesting because on the one hand, he accepts and is clearly influenced by many of the ideas of the missionaries at this time. He is influential in the foundation of a monotheistic branch of Brahmanical religion in Bengal at this time. He accepts and even carries to a new level the missionaries' criticisms of certain religious and cultural practices. In Bengal, for example, the practice of sati, of widow immolation at this time. But he too refuses to abandon his Brahmanical, his Hindu faith. He refuses to accept many of the criticisms of religion advanced by the missionaries, and ultimately, in a high-profile dispute, he actually challenges the monotheistic credentials of Christianity. It might seem hard for us now to get excited about a theological debate about monotheism and polytheism, but at the time, this is a big event and a big scandal, I guess. Here we have an influential Bengali figure who is pushing back against the ideas and the criticism that are being directed at aspects of his culture by the English Baptist mission. Okay, let me just mention, by way of conclusion, the penultimate chapter of the book, which considers the city of Calcutta, which in the 19th century becomes the capital of British India. In the middle of that century, of course, the control of the East India Company's territories are passed to the British Crown. India becomes a crown colony, the Raj, with Calcutta as its capital. And by the end of the 19th century, Calcutta is a city of more than 1 million people. I suggest in the book that by the standards of the time, we're thinking here about a mega city. Chapter 6 of the book, the penultimate chapter, explores the way in which the development of Calcutta at this time was dependent on the River Hooghly, specifically the way in which British authorities in Calcutta tried to understand the river and to manage it. The River Hooghly is at this time notoriously unpredictable. Navigation is dangerous. There is a strong tidal inflow. There is an unpredictable current coming downwards, down the river. There are areas where the river is very narrow and boats run aground. The chapter follows the way in which British authorities tried to understand the river, specifically by producing maps of it and by trying to chart the river's different currents and flows. Here we have one of the first English maps of the river by the well-known cartographer James Rennell. Here we have a very interesting chart from 50 or 60 years later, trying to understand the different sandbanks, the different shoals, and the different currents that make entering the river from the Bay of Bengal such a perilous exercise. The British realize that the survival and the thriving of Calcutta in the 19th century depends on better understanding how the river works, and in then trying to improve the river. And by that I mean to make it more predictable, to make it easier to navigate, to make it less dangerous. And the chapter follows or charts the attempts of different engineers to rake the riverbed, to dredge channels of the river, to redirect certain flows within it, to reinforce embankments, all with a view to taming and rendering more productive this waterway. That exercise becomes even more important when steamships are introduced on the Hooghly in the early 19th century. Here we see a steamer named after the river making its way up from Bengal or from the Hooghly into the main branch of the Ganges. The introduction of steam on the river is not only a practical measure that should make navigation easier, it's also a really important, it's really important symbolically for the British. The introduction of steam shipping symbolizes the advance of civilization for British engineers and colonial administrators. They see it as a necessary step in their rendering more productive and more tame the unruly natural environment of Bengal. But to cut a long story short, the British never succeed in truly taming the Hooghly. The introduction of steamships is a failure, and the voyage of steamships north of the city of Calcutta, further upriver, is slowly abandoned as the 1840s and 1850s roll on. And so I suggest, and this is where I will stop for now, I suggest that ultimately, after defeating other contenders for power in northern India, it's the River Hooghly itself that exposes to the British the limits of their power in Bengal at the end of the 19th century. Increasingly, British figures realize that their mastery of the River Hooghly itself will never be complete. And new questions are asked about the fragility of Calcutta and of the British in relation to the natural forces around them. There are particular moments, like the hurricane that strikes Calcutta in 1864, that really reinforce this point, that despite their best efforts, the British will never entirely be able to render the natural environment of Bengal as tame and as predictable as they would like. Let me just show you one final slide before we move on to questions. You might be wondering how these quite different chapters in the book fit together. Here is a summary which I'll leave on the screen as we maybe move to questions. A summary of some of the book's main themes that span different chapters that focus, as we've seen, on different countries and different contexts. They are, if you like, yes, what holds a book that, after all, covers a period of some 300 or 400 years and looks at the presence of different powers on the river. These are the themes that really stitch the book as a whole together.
Robert, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. Like many in your audience, I've travelled up the Hooghly to Chandernagore and Serampore, and my appreciation of what remains has been enhanced by your accessible and beautifully written account. It really is beautifully written. Written as a book, not as a PhD thesis that's been adapted, that sort of thing. It really is a lovely piece of work. I hope your publishers bring it out in a smaller paperback format. It's an ideal travel companion for visitors to Calcutta who want to know more of its colonial history and that of other nearby European settlements. Importantly, and I think this really sets your book apart, you talk about intellectual exchange, how French intellectuals used employee critiques of the English East India Company to advance ideas about how the French could do things better that were themselves veiled critiques of the Ancien Régime, and also how Danish Serampore's harbouring of Baptist missionaries banned by the EIC enabled reform-minded William Carey, Joshua Marshman and others to found a printing press likewise promulgating ideas that fed into the Bengal Renaissance. I mean, all that was absolutely fascinating and completely unknown to me. We have a few questions here, but I'm just going to ask one about what sort of interest there is amongst French historians in French India, and if there is any interest, what aspects of French India are they interested in?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Valerie. There are far more historians in France working on French colonialism in North America, in the Caribbean, in Africa. There are far fewer working on, and Southeast Asia actually, but there are far fewer working on the French in South Asia. And those studies that do exist, they rarely span the whole period of, I guess, the long 18th century. So from the foundation of the first French East India Company in 1664 through to the defeat of Napoleon, the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. There are very few studies that cover that 150-year period when France is really trying to rival, well, first the Portuguese and the Dutch, and then later the English in Bengal and elsewhere in India. That's partly because there wasn't just one French East India Company, there were many. When the first company failed and collapsed after 50 or 60 years, it was replaced by a second and then a third. And then finally, just before the revolution, a fourth East India Company. And in between those different initiatives, there were periods where France was encouraging, free trade, where France was encouraging its traders to go to India, but not confining that trade to one single kind of national trading company. So there are studies that look at, for example, the first French East India Company from 1664 through to 1715, roughly. There are studies, more studies that look at the second trading company from the 1720s to the 1760s, but there's very little that studies the period as a whole. The accounts that exist are mostly about the commercial activities of France in India. There's relatively little that asks the question of whether or not France had aspirations to become a territorial power in India in the 18th century, which undoubtedly at various points it did. And there's very little, I guess, that there's very little that is written about the French East India Company, but also shows a good understanding of what the Portuguese and the English and the Dutch and other Europeans are doing in India at this time. So one of the things that Hooghly tries to do is to, study not just one of the European presences, but to consider all of those different presences in India.
Moving away from the French, we've got a question here about piracy, which I suppose takes us back to the Portuguese. The question is, how active was piracy and the slave trade along the Hooghly? All settlements, including Calcutta, had slave markets.
Yeah, that's right. The Portuguese settlement at Hooghly and the other places in Bengal around Chittagong and eastern Bengal, where there's a Portuguese presence early on, so in the late 16th century. It's suggested, at least in the kind of Portuguese records of the time, that the Portuguese operating in those areas are operating illegally, that they don't recognize the authority of the Portuguese state, the Estado de India, with its capital in Goa. So they are being referred to in Portuguese sources of the time as bandits or pirates. And yes, the capture and trafficking of slaves is, undoubtedly one of their main activities. So we have some, detailed descriptions of the slave market at Hooghly at this time. But yes, absolutely. There are certainly slaves in all of the European settlements on the Hooghly at this time. We have some good, some detailed accounts of the presence of slaves at Chandernagore in French households at this time as well. Yeah, what do we mean when we say piracy? Well, I guess the suggestion is that we're talking about any sort of trade that is illegal. So that would mean that it's either condemned or not recognized as legal by the local authorities. So let's say the Mughal state in Bengal at this time, or not recognized by the different European powers as being legitimate. In the case of the Portuguese trade of slaves, it is condemned both by the Portuguese governor of Bengal at the time and by Portuguese authorities at Goa. In the latter case, not because they are against the slave trade, which of course very prevalent at Goa as well, but simply because they are operating, those Portuguese, in the Bay of Bengal without the sanction of the Portuguese authorities.
We've got another question that's along the same lines. Wasn't it hypocritical of the Mughals to object to Portuguese people trafficking, considering after the fall of Hooghly, they enslaved the captured population?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, yes. Yes, I guess it is. I guess it is. I don't think we should be surprised that these kinds of double standards exist. Yes.
Another question here. You don't say much about the Dutch in Bengal. Was this because they were a bit off the scene? What was their material and cultural legacy?
So there are 3 or 4 decades from the 1650s to, let's say, the 1690s, where Dutch trade is the most significant of the European trades on the river. This is after the expulsion of the Portuguese, and while the English East India Company is still finding its feet, I suppose, on the Hooghly. Yeah, those 4 decades are passed over quite briefly in the book, which doesn't have a chapter dedicated to the Dutch East India Company, which is perhaps a shame. One of the interesting things about the Dutch presence at this time is that the Dutch are trading between Bengal and Japan. There's definitely more that could be written on that topic, although yeah, that would no doubt involve bringing more Dutch sources into play. In terms of legacies of the Dutch, there are studies of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, in Bengal, but I'm sure there's far more to be yet to be written on the subject. The Dutch approach is, I guess, broadly similar to the English in the sense that the Dutch company is supported by the Dutch government and by the Dutch crown at the beginning. Is there a crown? Yes, but is also a private undertaking with private investors and money raised on money raised privately in Amsterdam, as for the English in London. The Portuguese and French presences at this time are trading companies or organizations that are far more closely connected to their crowns and don't have the same scope for private investment. So there's an organizational difference between the English and Dutch on the one hand and the French and Portuguese on the other. I don't know if I can say any more about the legacies of the Dutch really on the river.
We've got a question here relating to something you discussed earlier in your talk. It's why did conversion to Islam take place in East Bengal, in your opinion?
Yeah, okay. So I think we need to talk first about this word conversion. The conversion suggests a direct change from one thing to another, a change that's quite immediate, quite sudden, And for those reasons, it's probably not the right term for us to be using when we're talking about the development of a Muslim population in the Bengal Delta. This part of the second chapter of the book draws heavily on existing scholarship on the work of others, and I mentioned during my presentation tonight the name Richard Eaton. His argument is essentially that a slow process of acculturation takes place by which different local beliefs, which are largely polytheist, are gradually identified with Muslim beliefs, and how over time we see a transition from polytheism to monotheism, although some of the local practices and the local beliefs, they don't disappear. This is not a process of sweeping out pre-existing religions and replacing them with Islam. It's a process of well, the emergence of new and syncretic religious forms, I suppose. And crucially, sorry, just to add, sorry, crucially, it's a process that is not directed by the Mughal state, by Mughal authorities in Bengal at this time. It's a process that is probably shaped, almost certainly shaped by the gradual movement of Muslim religious leaders, Sufi peers into the Bengal Delta from the from the 17th century onwards.
Got a question, a sort of tourist type question here, which is probably going to interest everyone who's interested in visiting the European settlements or who's visited them. It is, which settlements have the best preserved colonial mansions, or are they all gone?
So on the Hooghly, there are lots of conservation organizations that are trying to restore buildings from, well, the colonial era along the river. At one point I was in touch with colleagues at the National Museum of Denmark. They're trying to restore or Danish mansions and the Danish church at Serampore. There's a similar organization trying to preserve or restore buildings in Chandernagore, that is also working, well, based out of Pondicherry, which is of course the largest French colony in India at this time. I mean, there are some very interesting mansions built by rich Bengalis at the beginning of the 19th century that can be visited in Calcutta from this period. Yeah, it would be great to see those restoration efforts kind of advance, really, so that more of those kind of mansions could be opened for visiting.
This question takes us back to the French in Chandernagore. It is, why did the French allow, I beg your pardon, why did the British allow the French back into Chandernagore and Pondicherry?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, this is all part of a peace that is negotiated between Britain and France at the end of the 7 Years' War, so the Treaty of Paris in 1763. There is it's a fairly common practice at the end of any war in this period among the European powers to restore at least some of the territories that have been captured by one or the other side. So there's a process of swapping going on, I suppose. In the case of the peace of 1763, France loses most or almost all of its possessions in North America, and several of the islands that it has previously controlled in the Caribbean. It loses control of most of its colonies on the western coast of Africa. They're involved in the trade of slaves across the Atlantic. In India, those 5 territories, essentially 5 towns, are restored to France. but as I mentioned, the French are no longer have permission to have an army at Chandernagore, to fortify the town. The idea is that they will be allowed to trade, but not to be a military or a territorial power. The wider context here is the wars between Britain and France in southern India in the 1740s and 1750s. There is a brief period where France has become a major territorial power in central and southern India, the Carnatic and the Deccan. The British are desperate to make sure that that situation doesn't reproduce itself. So the compromise that is found, I guess, in those peace negotiations is restoring 5 small trading posts and settlements that are be used solely for the purposes of commerce.
Here's another question. It is, what languages do you speak or read for research purposes?
Yeah, so for the book, English and French sources in the original, and then yes, Portuguese, Dutch, Persian, and Bengali sources in translation were used in the book.
Now, here's a question. I'm not quite sure what it relates to, but it was an early question, and it is, could you comment on the saffron, white, green flag, please?
I'm not sure if I can. Do we know any more about the question?
It may relate to something that was in one of the images. It may have had a flag, or it might be about, is it a national flag, saffron, white, green, or Bengali flag? I don't know. We'll see if the questioner tells us. Well, it's not coming up, so perhaps the questioner has left. Right, let's see if there are any other questions. Well, there aren't, and we're almost there. So what I'll say at this point is thank you very much again, Robert, for your excellent and informative talk and your most interesting book, available to all who have attended this lecture at the bargain price of £18.75. And that is a very good price for really rather beautifully produced hardback book. Gazing into my crystal ball, I foresee many years of tour leading for you up and down the Hooghly in between university terms. So thank you very much for taking us on this trip tonight with you. So,
my pleasure.
actually, we've got one new message which may be about the flag. It says, it looked very similar to current Indian national flag. So there's obviously an 18th century flag that looked like what the national flag is. But anyway,
yeah. If you can say, Naomi, which slide it was in, we can have a quick look. But I can't recall it off the top of my head.
Something about it was prominent in an early slide. So, well, that was earlier in the night, and now it's later in the night. So I think it's time to say good night. So good night, Robert, and good night, everyone. And thank you for coming, and look forward to seeing you at next month's lecture. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.